All right, so we're going to continue looking at the principles of business CSEC syllabus, and we previously covered section one, objectives one, two, three, and four. So today we are going to continue looking at the objective 5 and part of 6. All right, because objective 6 is kind of involved, it's kind of long. You have different types of business, forms of businesses. So we're going to break it down and we're going to look at the sole trade and the partnership. But today we're going to look at the differentiate between private and public sectors. Okay, and the concept that goes along with those things. These topics can be really, really involved, really in depth, but because it's a high school level, CXA, CSEC is a high school level, we are just going to touch basically the surface of these concepts. So let's just jump right into it. So we're looking at this picture, these slides, and we can see it has a little table and a breakdown of the private versus the public sector. Like I said, it's very surface level. It's not really too in depth. So let's dig into it though. Private sector, public sector. Types of businesses that are found in the private sector. So some examples of businesses found in the private sector, types of businesses would be like the sole trader, the partnership, companies, and cooperatives. And we're going to dig deeper into each of those later on. But for now, we just know that these are types of businesses that are found in the private sector. You have a sole trader, your partnership, your companies, and your cooperatives. In the public sector, on the other hand, you have government departments, state corporation, nationalized industries. So one of the key distinctions between the private sector and the public sector, apart from the types of businesses, would be ownership and control. Ownership and control is one of the key distinctions between the private sector and the public sector. The private sector, the ownership and control lies in the hands of the owners of the business and the shareholders in the business. Shareholders are also part owners of a business. So for the private sector, you have the owners of the business and the shareholders. In the public sector now, you have the ownership and control being done by the government and the voters, the citizens. Okay, the government and the citizens are the ones, the voters are the ones who own and control the businesses in the public sector. Now, control here is a somewhat of a strong word because the average person can go in off the road and start controlling how a government does their business. You control it by means of voting. Okay, based on the election, then based on who wins, then you give them the opportunity to conduct that business on your behalf. So ownership and control under the private sector is by the owners or the shareholders, whereas for the public sector, it's the government and the voters. Now, a simpler way to look at private versus public sector is to simply say the private sector is owned by private individuals or private groups and individuals, where the public sector is owned and are controlled by the government and the voters or the citizens. Now, a next distinct feature that makes them different is the main motive for which each exists. The main motive for which each exists. So, of course, the main aim of any business, especially in the private sector, is to make a profit. So, the private sector is pushed or spurred by the profit motive. Their main agenda is to make profit. Whereas the public sector, their main objective is to look out for the welfare of the citizens, look out for the people, look out for the best interest of the people. That's their main motive. So sometimes the government might make a loss, they're in deficit just to make the citizens or the people in the country better off. Whereas private sector, huh, ain't nobody in private sector going to go in business to make a loss. If they're making a loss, of course, they're going to shut down. They ain't in this charity thing. So the main motive for private sector businesses uh, is profit. Whereas for the public sector, the main motive is, of course, the best interest, the welfare of the citizens, of the public. Source of capital, or another way of putting that, where do they get the money from? Where does the private sector get its money? Where does the public sector get its money? The private sector gets its money from banks, go to the bank for a loan, your private savings, investors, those kind of things. That's where the private sector gets most of its money from. They go for a loan from the bank, family and friends, savings, private investors, those kind of things are where that's where the private sector gets its money from. On the other hand, the public sector gets most of its money from, of course, the taxpayers. The taxpayers are the ones who funds the public sector. So the prime minister, the minister of government, the public schools, the health services, all those things are funded by the taxpayers. All the citizens in the country who are working and paying tax, they are the ones who provide funding for the public sector. Also, the government actually go and borrow money to help and fund the public sector. The government can go and borrow money from like the IMF, the World Bank, various private banks also. Some governments actually borrow from banks. They can also borrow from other governments. So the public sector, their main sources of funding comes from the taxpayer and the government themselves borrowing from other entities. So those are some of the key distinctions between the private sector, public sector. Again, the private sector types of businesses, sole trader, partnership, companies, franchises, cooperatives, those things. In the public sector, on the other hand, the main types of businesses are the government departments, the state corporations, the nationalized industries. Nationalized industries are those that are owned and operated by the government. The government take control of them. An example of this would be your normal utility companies, your electricity company, maybe your water company, those things. Majority of them are nationalized. They are run by the government utilities. Ownership and control, again, private sector. Owners and shareholders. They are the ones who own and operate the businesses in the private sector. Public sector, the government and the voters are the ones who are in control, are the ones who run the sector. Main motive, again, private sector, the main motive is a profit driven motive. The main aim is to gain profit, make money, not loss. Whereas the main motive of the public sector is to look out for the welfare, the well being of the citizens. Okay, to provide public services, to provide welfare services for the citizens, make sure that everybody is in have a good standard of living in the country. Source of capital for the private sector, again, you can go to a bank, savings, investors, family, friend, stock markets, those kind of things. Public sector, the main sources of funding would be taxation, the taxpayers, and the government going out and actually borrowing money from other entities. Okay, so that's basically it. That's all you need to know for private and public sectors. It's very simple, very straightforward, very surface, as I said. So let's move on to some more information on this topic. So, one thing you should not confuse is public companies and public sector because they are two different things. You have your public companies or your public limited companies, and you have your public sector. And again, we're going to go more in depth with companies later on. So, public companies are owned by their shareholders. Their shares are traded on the stock exchange. They are part of the private sector. So, although they are called public companies, they are still a part of the private sector. They are not publicly owned companies. The government don't run these companies. They are still a part of the private sector. Just that they allow members of the public to take part in buying shares and being a part owner if you have the money to do so. Whereas the public sector, as we just mentioned, is made up of organizations which are owned by the government. So the government runs the public sector. They own and operate the public sector. So don't confuse the two. Okay, I don't know if that something we may say a question asking the difference to differentiate, and that's where you get it. Do not confuse the two. Government departments, as we said earlier, the public sector has a bunch of departments that are owned and operated by the government. Okay, in most Caribbean countries, we have various ministries: Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of maybe Justice, whatever the ministry might be called. And under each ministry, you have different departments. So you have the health department, the agricultural science department, those kind of things. And all those are run by pub civil servants. They are run by the public servants or the civil servants. those the head of most of these departments or these ministry, the main head is not always the politician. Yes, might be the head, the one elected representative, but they choose someone to run it on their behalf, and these persons are called the PS or the permanent secretaries. So the permanent secretaries, for example, in the Ministry of Education, the permanent secretary is the one who controls most of the things that happens in the Ministry of Education, because most elected members of parliament have other portfolios. So somebody who's in charge of education might also be in charge of sports or youth development or something like that. So they don't have time to sit down and run every single ministry, every single, department as they would like. So they elect the highest ranking member, which is the permanent secretary, and they are the ones who overlook the running of the various ministries or the various departments. All right, so we have an infograph of or an organizational chart of the average ministry across the Caribbean, across the region. Okay, you have the ministry, you have the minister, the cabinet, and you have permanent secretary. They are normally the ones who are the head of various departments. Okay, so that's just how it is normally set up. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of government departments, and let's run through them quickly. Advantages: provide services which are needed but not profitable. Like I said before, the private sector is not in business for charity. If they're going to make a loss, they're not going to engage in that business. That's where the government comes in. Where the private sector falls short, the government comes in and take up the slack and provide services that might run at a loss and are not profitable. But these are things that we need: healthcare, education, police, infrastructure, all those things. Can employ professional experts and consultants, of course. Can raise funds for major investments. Okay, so you go to the taxpayer, they say, okay, look, we have this program we want to run. You can hike the VAT, put on a little extra 5% on the VAT or take it off, whatever you want to do, but you can use the tax system to raise funds. Can consider social objectives as well as profit. Okay, so sometimes, some companies, some parts of the government actually, they have parts of the government that you call the statutory bodies. They are part of the government, but they still are in charge of making profit. They actually operate themselves. Okay, so that's the exception. All right, advantages. Voters can remove politicians if service is poor. So, sometimes you go to a private company and service is terrible. All you can do is do make noise, but you can't really do anything. You might say, I want to see the manager, but you don't really have any say. But with a government department, if it's been run poorly, you can go to the polling booth, the polling station, and vote out whoever is in power to try and get a better service in the future. And of course, disadvantages: resources may not be managed effectively. If it's one thing you should know about government departments, government run entities, is that they are not really efficient, because government have to worry about votes and those kind of things. So you might see them hire 10 persons to do the job that only one person can do. So you get to a utility company, you're trying to get something done. You have to go to one, two, three, four, 5 persons to get something done when you can go to one person in the private sector. That's because they're not really run efficiently. Most government companies are not efficiently run. It's just the nature of it. Governments are concerned about their vote and their voters and those kind of things, so they'll do things to appease the voters. Politicians may micromanage day-to-day decisions. So again, if you're running a public enterprise under the public sector, there's so much paperwork you might have to go through, so much red tape you have to go through. If you want to make a decision, you have to go up the chain, right up to the top, right up to the politician himself. You can't just up and do something, because you have to answer to everybody above you. Sometimes in the private sector, the boss would delegate responsibility to, the average person, and they can make certain decisions on their own. But normally in the public sector, you have to run everything up the chain, right up the food chain. A lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape. So it tend to be inefficient in this sector. All right, some staff may not work hard to provide service. Why? Why? Because you are a member of a certain political party. The government hires you. You know that they want your vote, so therefore you're not going to put in your all. Sometimes you go out, you come in late, you leave work whenever you want, you go up and down the place when you have work to do, because if they try to fire you, problems. You start talking about vote and all kind of stuff, and it's problems for them, giving them a bad name, and they don't want to look bad. So of course they're gonna keep you employed. And the next big problem with government departments is favoritism may affect the service and job allocation. For example, most Caribbean countries have a two-party system. You have one party and next party. If this party wins election, they're gonna hire their people, and so therefore somebody who might be qualified but they don't vote for them out of a job. So that's one of the problems with government and those things. They don't. Sometimes it's not merit based. Sometimes it's a favoritism thing. So that's an issue. All right. So that's just the differentiating the private sector versus the public sector. That's just it in a nutshell.